Welcome back to Crypto Equation, and today we are diving into one of the most urgent and least understood realities in the XRP ecosystem, the truth about owning 3,000 XRP and why a supply shock is forming beneath the surface that almost nobody is prepared for, because the real shift happening right now has nothing to do with price predictions, bull runs, or speculation. It has everything to do with the silent migration of XRP away from public markets and into institutional mechanisms that will eventually remove vast amounts of XRP from the circulating supply without retail investors noticing until the window has already closed. The real story behind 3,000 XRP has never been about becoming wealthy overnight or chasing market hype. It has always been about positioning yourself inside a digital asset that is slowly leaving the speculative world and moving into the settlement infrastructure of the global financial system. And once that migration completes, holders will look back at the chance to accumulate 3,000 XRP, the same way early internet pioneers look back at domain names, or early investors look at pre-IPO equity. A moment of opportunity that was obvious in hindsight, but invisible to most while it was still unfolding. The supply shock forming today is not caused by lack of interest or declining demand. It is caused by something far bigger and more structural: the absorption of XRP into systems that require it for real-world functionality, systems that do not trade emotionally, systems that do not speculate, systems that do not sell, systems that do not return tokens back to the open market. Because XRP used for settlement becomes infrastructure, and infrastructure does not circulate freely. This is the silent truth behind the future of XRP. The supply that is visible on public exchanges today is not the supply that will remain available tomorrow. To understand the supply shock nobody is ready for, we must begin with how XRP is being quietly integrated into institutional channels. Because institutions do not buy XRP for fun. They buy it to eliminate friction, reduce costs, replace pre-funded accounts, enable instant settlement, and automate financial flows across borders. This means they do not buy some XRP on Monday and sell it on Friday. They acquire it, lock it into corridors, and never look back. And once XRP enters these corridors, it does not re-enter public markets. It becomes part of the machine that moves value globally. This alone changes everything about the supply dynamics of XRP. Most retail investors still believe that XRP is a speculative asset that will always remain publicly available. But real settlement assets do not remain freely accessible because they are not designed for trading. They are designed for function. They are designed for speed. They are designed for utility, and they are designed for systems, not consumers. Now let us explore why 3,000 XRP specifically becomes such a meaningful number. 3,000 XRP is not a random target. It is the threshold where functional ownership meets future scarcity, the point where early positioning intersects with future absorption, the midpoint between what retail can still accumulate and what institutions are already beginning to pull away from the public supply. When institutions start absorbing XRP, the supply accessible to the public does not slowly decline, it collapses quietly over time, because institutional demand does not behave like retail demand. Institutions do not nibble. They acquire in bulk. They lock supply instantly. They use assets continuously. This creates a supply vacuum, a vacuum that grows silently. A vacuum retail investors will only notice when it is too late. Now let us go deeper into the mechanism creating this vacuum, the transition from pre-funded accounts to on-demand liquidity. Today, banks and financial institutions lock away trillions of dollars in Nostro and Vostro accounts just to move value across borders. This system is slow, wasteful, inefficient, and outdated, but it is currently the backbone of global finance. When institutions migrate from trapped accounts to real-time liquidity using digital assets, that liquidity must come from somewhere. That somewhere is XRP. When these systems turn on, they do not request small amounts. They consume large pools of XRP to maintain operational liquidity. The moment these pools are created, the XRP inside them becomes locked permanently, no matter what the market is doing. This is the first layer of the supply shock. The second layer is corridor scaling. When corridor pilots expand into full settlement channels, they require exponentially more XRP, not linearly, but exponentially, because settlement volume grows far faster than initial liquidity requirements. This means every corridor expansion absorbs more supply than the previous one. By the time 10 to 20 corridors go live, the amount of publicly available XRP will shrink dramatically. The third layer is regulatory clarity. Once institutions have fully regulated frameworks for using XRP at scale, the restrictions that currently slow them down disappear. At that point, institutional adoption accelerates faster than retail can comprehend, and supply absorbs faster than retail can compete with. The fourth layer is tokenization. Tokenized assets require settlement rails. Settlement rails require liquidity. Liquidity requires bridge assets. Bridge assets require depth, and depth requires massive amounts of XRP locked into automated settlement channels. Every tokenized bond, every tokenized security, every tokenized real estate product, every tokenized currency, every corporate treasury movement will require neutral liquidity mechanisms. This is where XRP establishes true systemic relevance. And this is where the supply shock becomes unstoppable, because retail investors cannot compete with institutional liquidity demand. Now let us uncover another truth almost no one considers: XRP is not mined, meaning the supply does not expand to meet demand. It only shrinks as it becomes absorbed into systems. Every institutional integration, every corridor activation, every treasury automation, every cross-border settlement channel reduces the accessible float. This creates supply compression. Supply compression creates structural scarcity. Structural scarcity creates a psychological supply shock even before demand peaks. Now, let us explore a deeper layer. Most people miss the disappearance of retail availability. Supply shocks rarely happen because systems run out of supply. They happen because the available supply becomes inaccessible. For XRP, this means the supply shock will not feel like a gradual price rise. It will feel like sudden disappearance. Retail investors will one day look at exchanges and see limited depth, then limited availability, then restricted pairs, then institutional priority access, then corridor consumption, then exchange delisting in certain jurisdictions, then a moment where XRP is no longer widely available to retail markets. This is the pattern. This is the design. This is how infrastructure assets behave. Now let us explore the psychological misunderstanding behind why most investors fail to see this coming. They think XRP remains accessible because it is accessible now. They believe the present guarantees the future. But accessibility is never permanent. It is temporary, especially for assets moving into institutional rails. XRP's presence on exchanges today is a transitional phase, not a permanent reality. The moment XRP becomes fully integrated supply becomes something entirely different. Institutions will not release XRP back into public markets once it becomes part of global liquidity architecture. Now let us go even deeper: the unstoppable convergence of global financial modernization. Across the world, banks are upgrading messaging standards. Payment systems are synchronizing, real-time frameworks are rolling out. Digital ID systems are being integrated. CBDCs are in pilot phase, cross-border settlement channels are being tested, and tokenized assets are being prepared for full-scale operational use. All of these upgrades have one thing in common: they require real-time liquidity. When the world goes real-time, the world will not tolerate delays. Liquidity must move at the speed of information, and assets that can fulfill this role will be consumed by the infrastructure. This is where 3,000 XRP becomes dramatically more meaningful than it appears today, not because of price, but because of access. Not because of speculation, but because of utility. Not because of hype, but because of architecture. 3,000 XRP becomes a future relic, a rare position from an era where XRP was still available to the public. This is the truth nobody is ready for. The supply shock is not coming from the market. It is coming from the system. And the system absorbs silently until nothing is left for those who hesitated. In part 2, we will go even deeper into the stages of the XRP supply, shock the institutional accumulation timeline, the corridor expansion model, the psychological trap retail investors fall into the moment supply becomes inaccessible, and how 3,000 XRP will eventually cross from achievable target into a future privilege. Because now that we have exposed the foundation of the supply shock forming beneath the surface, we must go deeper into the hidden stages of this transition, stages that unfold quietly, stages that institutions understand, but retail investors rarely notice, stages that transform XRP from a speculative asset into financial infrastructure and permanently alter what it means to own 3,000 XRP. The first stage of the supply shock is the institutional preparation phase, the moment when banks and financial institutions quietly align their systems with the technology they will eventually use. This phase is invisible to retail markets because institutions do not announce their early preparation. They modernize messaging, they test corridors, they integrate new APIs, they establish liquidity frameworks, they create treasury automation logic. All of this happens before a single unit of XRP is absorbed from the public float. This is the calm before the storm, the moment when XRP is still widely available but already marked for migration. The second stage of the supply shock is the liquidity activation phase. This is when institutions begin sourcing XRP, not to speculate on it, but to use it. Institutions do not buy 20 XRP or 50 XRP. They buy in the millions and tens of millions because institutions do not participate in markets emotionally. They participate to fulfill functional requirements. When liquidity activation begins, retail markets barely feel the shift at first. But then something changes. Public exchanges begin noticing tighter liquidity. The order books begin to thin. Large buy orders appear sporadically. Long-term holders remove XRP from circulation by storing it in cold wallets. Institutional custodians begin accumulating supply directly. All of these actions squeeze availability quietly and steadily. The third stage of the supply shock is corridor expansion. Corridors are the highways through which value moves across borders. When a corridor goes live, it requires a pool of XRP to remain inside that corridor permanently. Once the corridor is active, the XRP used inside it never returns to public markets. This means each corridor absorbs supply, and the more corridors that activate, the faster the supply shrinks. When 10 corridors activate retail notices. When 20 corridors activate exchanges notice. When 50 corridors activate, the entire market structure changes. This is where the true acceleration begins. The fourth stage of the supply shock is regulatory clarity. This may seem unrelated to supply, but it is the trigger institutions have been waiting for. Regulatory clarity removes hesitation. It removes uncertainty. It allows institutions to scale without fear of regulatory conflict. And once clarity is established, institutions move faster than retail expects, faster than markets anticipate, faster than exchanges can adapt. This is the moment when corridor demand spikes suddenly, as institutions no longer hesitate to use digital assets for settlement. The supply begins to drain at a rate incompatible with retail expectations. The fifth stage of the supply shock is the disappearance of retail availability. This is one of the most misunderstood phases. The supply does not physically disappear. The supply becomes inaccessible because infrastructure assets do not remain liquid on retail markets. Once absorbed, they stay absorbed. Retail exchanges begin listing warnings about liquidity depth. Some exchanges remove XRP pairs due to low volume. Others limit withdrawals because institutional demand raises volatility. Eventually, certain regions classify XRP as a utility asset rather than a speculative one, meaning retail participation becomes restricted by design, not by market pressure. This is the part of the shock that people will remember years later, the moment they realized XRP was not a crypto anymore. It was infrastructure, and infrastructure does not sit on trading apps waiting for retail buyers. The sixth stage of the supply shock is tokenization expansion. Tokenized bonds, tokenized securities, tokenized commodities, tokenized real estate, tokenized currencies, and more are coming into the global economy. Tokenized markets require instant settlement, and instant settlement requires liquidity. When tokenization scales, XRP becomes a critical settlement bridge. This part alone is enough to absorb massive amounts of XRP permanently. Every settlement channel locks more supply. Every blockchain interoperability layer locks more supply. Every CBDC integration locks more supply. Every treasury automation system locks more supply. This is the part where the supply shock intensifies. The seventh stage of the supply shock is velocity compression. Velocity compression occurs when the same amount of XRP must serve increasing transaction volume faster than its velocity can scale. When velocity compresses, institutions must hold more XRP to maintain stable settlement. This creates additional pressure on supply, increasing the amount of liquidity locked away in institutional systems. This is the moment when the retail market realizes too late that the float they believed would always remain accessible has already been absorbed for system stability. The eighth stage of the supply shock is institutional exclusivity. This is where XRP fully migrates into financial infrastructure. Retail exchanges no longer offer XRP widely. Liquidity pools become institution only. Custodians prioritize banks and corporations over traders. Settlement corridors require guaranteed liquidity flows. Once exclusivity begins, retail ownership plateaus permanently. The ninth stage of the supply shock is the global financial merger, the synchronization of digital identity systems, instant payment networks, cross-border rails, digital currencies, and tokenized asset settlement. Once these systems merge, XRP becomes part of the digital plumbing of the global economy. This is the stage where supply becomes irrelevant to speculation. It becomes entirely determined by functional demand. And in this world, 3,000 XRP becomes something extraordinary, a relic from the early phase of the system, a position in an asset that is no longer accessible to the average person. The 10th stage of the supply shock is the psychological realization, the day when the world wakes up and understands that XRP was never meant to remain a speculative asset. It was meant to run the rails of global liquidity. and assets that run global liquidity do not remain available to buy on exchanges. They become part of the system itself. This is the moment when the significance of owning 3,000 XRP becomes clear, not because of price action, not because of hype, not because of predictions, but because of scarcity of access, scarcity of availability, scarcity of utility, and scarcity driven by integration into infrastructure. This final realization is what transforms 3,000 XRP from a simple target into a future luxury. People will look back and ask how anyone was able to accumulate such an amount. The answer will be simple, because they lived in the era before the supply shock. Now we must confront the truth behind this entire script. The supply shock is not something that happens overnight. It happens in layers, it happens in silence, it happens through infrastructure, it happens through institutions, it happens through systems absorbing liquidity permanently. XRP's availability today is not a guarantee for tomorrow. It is a temporary window in a long-term migration. A migration from public markets into global settlement rails. A migration from speculation into infrastructure. A migration from accessibility into exclusivity. And when this migration completes, owning 3,000 XRP will be a story only early adopters can tell. The supply shock nobody is ready for is already unfolding, but only a few understand the significance of what is happening. 3,000 XRP is available now. In the future, it will not be easy to obtain. In the future, it may not be obtainable at all. And this is the truth behind the supply shock forming right beneath the surface. This is where 3,000 XRP becomes dramatically more meaningful than it appears today. Not because of price, but because of access. Not because of speculation, but because of utility. Not because of hype, but because of architecture. 3,000 XRP becomes a future relic, a rare position from an era where XRP was still available to the public. This is the truth nobody is ready for. The supply shock is not coming from the market, it is coming from the system. And the system absorbs silently until nothing is left for those who hesitated. In part 2, we will go even deeper into the stages of the XRP supply shock, the institutional accumulation timeline, the corridor expansion model, the psychological trap retail investors fall into, the moment supply becomes inaccessible, and how 3,000 XRP will eventually cross from achievable target into a future privilege.